I didn't know I'd be talking to this many people. I'm not a public speaker. But down through the years, every now and then when somebody remembered something about our family, I'd write it down. So it's going to be back and forth and back and forth. You just have to take what it is. I didn't have time to. Anyway, I'm talking about the Lindholm family, and I'm sorry, Nelson family, and you're just as valuable, but
We're fine.
we'll let you make talk next time. I'm beginning with my dad, Fred Lindholm. That was my father. We were 7 children, 4 boys and 3 girls. I'm the Ben, Mary Ann's father. Where's Mary Ann? Her father was the oldest, and then I was next. And your father was so good to help me. I'd have never made it with my 3 girls if your dad hadn't helped me. Anyway, we called him Papa. We had Papa and Mama back in those days. I was born in 1924, and then the Depression started. Anyway, my mother died when I was 9 years old in 1933. I was 9 years old when my mother died, and when she had cancer, and when she got it, she needed help, so she went up to the cities to live with her sister up there, and her 2 sisters took care of her in the cities. And then we 7 children, we'll come to that. When Mama Ruth died, we children stayed with Aunt Hannah while Papa went up to Minneapolis to see her. And then he came back late in the afternoon. And one day he just sat in the car and he couldn't get out, he was crying. And finally Aunt Hannah came out and talked to him, and Aunt Hannah, and that's the mother, the grandmother of the Nelsons.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Anyway, then Hannah went out, and then they both cried. And then I knew something was going on, so I was 9 years old. I finally went over near them, and from what they were saying, I knew that my mother had died. And I couldn't take it. I just couldn't take it. I started crying, and I went and under there were a lot of lilac trees there. I remember I climbed into the lilac trees, and I cried, and I cried, and I cried myself sick. It took a long time. Mama wasn't ever coming home again. Anyway, and then finally my dad felt good enough that he could drive us home, because Aunt Hannah told him, you know, Ruth isn't here anymore, but you have 7 children. You have to take care of your children. And Mama had told my dad that, take care of the children before she died. So he finally felt good enough that he could drive us home, but they couldn't find me. So they're all looking all over for me. And I just sat and they asked, I didn't realize what they were doing, but they finally found me and got me to come out and get in the car. Anyway, so then we got home, we went to bed, and the next morning when I got up, Papa had cooked oatmeal. Now we were quite a bunch of us, so it's a big kettle of oatmeal, and you had to have this is back in the 1930s. There weren't any gas stoves or electric stoves. There wasn't even electric yet in our homes. It was wood stoves, and you had to go out and chop wood and bring the wood in and light the fire and keep it going, keep it hot enough. And he had cooked the oatmeal. Well, then I kind of kept stirring it so it didn't burn until we ate. And then he tried to get us to wake up. You know, kids, we weren't going to, but we all woke up and came down and had oatmeal. That first year, we ate an awful lot of oatmeal because you know who chief cook was? You got her right here. I was 9 years old. And sometimes at breakfast, Papa would buy cornflakes. Cornflakes was a brand new thing back then, one of the first cereals out. And Papa liked cornflakes. So every now and then he'd get a box of cornflakes for himself. In the 1930s, that was a new thing. And a new use for the cardboard box. Because my father's shoes would wear out. And he didn't and then I remember it was time to start school in the fall, and Ben was the one that needed shoes. My oldest brother, Ben, needed shoes for school. And my father's had holes in the bottom of his, and he's the working man in the family. So my father took the cornflakes box and cut as much of that cardboard as he could, the size of the shoe, and put it in his shoe. And they went to town and got new shoes for Bennett so he could go to school. That's my father. And your relative, your grandfather or great-grandfather, whatever it is. And every morning he'd cook, get the oatmeal started cooking, and then he was out milking the cows, and then I'd finish with the oatmeal, and that's what we had. And then he'd be out in the field working. He's a farmer, so then I'd put the. Is there a 9-year-old girl here?
Where are they?
You know how big is a 9-year-old girl? How big are their hands or their feet or how as they stand up and cook at a cook stove?
How old is Maisie?
Selah. Selah's 9.
Yeah.
No, Selah,
And you
she's
stand
gonna
by
be
that big
12.
cook stove, and then you have this big kettle of oatmeal, and you're stirring it. I'm 9 years old. Anyway, in those times there was no one to hire to come and do it, and all the relatives had their own things going. Anyway, Papa took us to church every Sunday, and that was held at the number 9 school. And then Uncle Axel was one of. Oh yeah, you're related. He was one of them that kept that church going. And we were in Sunday school every Sunday. And see, Dad had a whole family to support. And with farming, nobody hands you a check when you sell some grain or sell a cow or something. So he would do odd jobs for anyone, you know. And instead of being around taking care of the kids. And I should say, my brother Arthur was, in my older years, I sometimes say a little cry from him. My brother Arthur was 4 years old. And how much loving and caring as he get? I'm 9 years old. It's all I can do to cook and wash clothes. I had to do the washing and all that stuff. Anyway. But Art was kind of our favorite of the kids because he was so cute with big eyes, and if he'd do some little thing and we were going to scold him, he could just look up at us with his big blue eyes, and we never scolded Art. Anyway, and when I look back, I'm so glad. He's only 4 years old. They need a mother to love him and take care of him. Anyway, what my dad would do, he fixed cars or anything in tractors or any. My dad was a born machinist, whatever you call it. He knew how, he'd figure out right away how things ran. There's a lot of you smart people here too, that it's in the family. And I know like in Red Wing, they have those two big manufacturing plants in there, and sometimes the thing would break down and they couldn't figure it, and they'd call Fred. And he would figure out, he didn't have school book learning or anything like that, but he'd just figure out how that machine was supposed to work and what wasn't right, and he'd fix it. So anyway, so now and then he did that. And then he made a homemade thing to saw wood into lumber. Back in those days, people were still building houses, or building chicken houses or pig houses or whatever, and they needed lumber. So he would saw logs into boards. That's a hard work job, but others would help him in that family, or would. At one time, my dad he liked to do interesting things. He got a battery for a battery radio. See, there's no electricity in the country, but Dad had fixed a thing with a windmill that went around and did things down here, and then you'd have electricity for an hour or so. But anyway, then he got a battery radio. And the neighborhood men came in the evening to hear boxing. Back in the 30s and 40s, it wasn't football or any of that, it was boxing.
Oh.
And I should be able to remember it and tell you the names of all the boxers that won in that, but I've forgotten. But the boxing was a big thing, and all the men would sit around that radio, and like those radios, this is an old-time radio. They had two round things here, and you had to have both of them exactly on the right spot before the voice would come through clear. Anyway, but he had a battery radio. Here's all our neighbor men sitting around the table listening to the boxing.
Marie, can we all just say goodbye to Uncle Frank?
Yes.
Bye, Uncle Frank.
Bye, Uncle Frank.